Hi guys, tonight I want to invite you into a quiet mystery, one that begins with wind moving gently across an endless desert and the faint feeling that something ancient is waiting just beneath the sand. Imagine a place the world has forgotten, cities erased, not by fire or war, but by time itself. And one person who listens closely enough to hear them calling. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Maybe it's late evening in the US, the deep night hours in Europe, or the soft early morning somewhere else in the world. Your support helps these stories reach more listeners who need calm, comfort, and rest. Now settle into a comfortable position. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breathing slow, and allow the day to gently fade away. The desert night is quiet, the stars are wide above us, and the story is about to begin. The desert breathed slowly under the first light of dawn, its vast waves of sand glowing softly in pale gold and rose. Wind traced gentle patterns across the dunes, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made, as if the land itself preferred silence and secrecy. To most, this place was empty, an expanse to be crossed, endured, or avoided. But to Elias Corvin, it was alive with memory. He stood still at the crest of a dune, his boots half buried in cool sand, listening, not with his ears alone, but with a deeper attention shaped by years of waiting and watching. The desert spoke in subtle ways, the way the wind hesitated near certain slopes, the way stones surfaced where they did not belong, the way the sand settled differently over hidden shapes. Beneath him, far below the surface, something ancient rested. Elias was an archaeologist, though that word felt too small for what he truly was. He was a keeper of lost cities, a listener to places erased from maps and memory. While others chased fame, grants, and headlines, Elias followed whispers, half-forgotten stories, fragments of legend, the quiet pull he felt when standing on land that had once known voices, footsteps, and firelight. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread gently through the air. Elias knelt and let the sand run slowly through his fingers. It was fine here, almost silky, carried from far away over centuries. Cities could vanish under such patience, streets, homes, temples, layer by layer, breath by breath, until nothing remained but a smooth, unbroken horizon. He closed his eyes and imagined what once stood here. He did not force the vision. He allowed it to come softly. Stone walls catching the sun, a marketplace murmuring with life, children running, water poured into clay cups, evening prayers rising into the cooling air. These images did not arrive sharply, but like dreams, gentle, incomplete, yet deeply felt. There was struggle in this work, years of failure, funding that vanished, colleagues who quietly shook their heads, nights alone under unfamiliar stars, wondering if he had mistaken imagination for truth. Yet hope remained, steady and calm. Because sometimes when the desert grew very still, Elias felt certain he was not alone. The cities were patient. They had waited centuries. They could wait a little longer. A sudden breeze passed over the dune, lifting a thin veil of sand and revealing the faintest edge of worked stone before covering it again. Elias smiled, slow and peaceful. The desert had spoken. Morning stretched quietly across the desert, and Elias returned to his small camp, nestled between two low dunes. The canvas of his tent fluttered softly, and a kettle warmed over a modest flame, releasing a faint, comforting scent of tea leaves and metal. These small rituals grounded him, anchoring him to the present while his mind wandered through centuries past. Inside the tent, rolled maps lay scattered like sleeping birds. Some were modern satellite prints, others fragile reproductions of ancient trade routes, and a few were nothing more than sketches copied from travelers' journals, written in languages few still read. Elias handled them with care, his fingertips tracing lines that crossed empty spaces labeled only with uncertainty. Many of these maps contradicted one another. Rivers appeared where no water flowed. Cities were marked where only dunes now stood. Yet these inconsistencies were exactly what drew him in. One map, yellowed and faintly torn at the edges, always held his attention the longest. It had been found tucked inside a monastery library far from the desert, mislabeled and forgotten. The ink was faded, the script uneven, but a symbol near its center had kept Elias awake for many nights, a simple circle surrounded by marks that suggested walls, gates, and something like towers. No name accompanied it, just silence. As he studied it now, the desert light filtered through the tent's thin fabric, casting slow-moving shadows across the parchment. Elias breathed steadily, letting his thoughts move at the same unhurried pace. He had learned long ago that rushing the past only pushed it farther away. Instead, he allowed the pieces to arrange themselves naturally, like sand settling after the wind passes. Outside, the desert hummed softly, heat beginning to rise in gentle waves. Elias noticed how the symbol on the map aligned almost perfectly with where he had stood earlier that morning. The realization did not strike him with excitement, but with a quiet certainty. It felt less like discovery and more like recognition, as if he had arrived at a place already expecting him. He remembered the voices of doubt from years before. Professors who told him the desert held only scattered ruins, not cities. Colleagues who advised safer projects, clearer results. Their concerns had been practical, even kind. But Elias had chosen a slower path, guided by patience and trust in subtle signs. He rolled the map carefully and set it aside, sipping his tea as the warmth spread through him. Today would not be about digging or forcing answers. Today was for walking, observing, and listening again. The desert would reveal what it wished, when it wished. And beneath the calm surface of sand and sky, something old and waiting seemed to stir, not urgently, not loudly, but with the steady rhythm of a memory returning. The sun climbed higher, yet the heat remained gentle, softened by a light wind that brushed the desert like a slow, reassuring breath. Elias packed only what he needed: water, a small brush, a notebook worn smooth by years of use, and the quiet confidence born from long familiarity with solitude. He stepped away from the camp and began to walk. Each footstep sank softly into the sand, then vanished behind him as the wind erased all sign of passage. Elias found comfort in this. The desert asked nothing, kept nothing, and judged nothing. It simply existed, patient and vast. As he moved, he followed not a straight line, but a subtle curve shaped by intuition and observation. The ground changed almost imperceptibly beneath his feet, sand growing slightly firmer, grains clinging together as if held by something below. He paused often, kneeling to touch the surface. In some places, the sand felt cooler, shaded by unseen stone. In others, tiny fragments glimmered briefly in the light, chips of pottery worn smooth, no larger than a fingernail. To most eyes, they were nothing. To Elias, they were whispers. He imagined the last people who had walked here, their feet pressing into soil that had not yet become desert. Perhaps they carried water jars or baskets of grain. Perhaps they laughed or argued or walked in silence, thinking of the evening meal. The thought did not bring sadness, but a calm respect. Lives had been lived fully here, even if the world no longer remembered their names. There was struggle in this imagining, too. Elias knew that uncovering a city meant disturbing its long sleep. He believed deeply in preservation, in care, in listening before acting. The balance was delicate between knowledge and humility, between discovery and restraint. Some days the weight of that responsibility felt heavy, but today it rested lightly, like the sand itself. As the afternoon light softened, Elias noticed a pattern ahead, an unnatural ripple in the dunes, aligned too neatly to be the work of chance. He slowed his pace, heart steady, breath calm. With a gentle brush of his hand, he cleared away a thin layer of sand. Stone emerged. Not much, just a corner, worn and smooth, shaped by human hands, long ago. Elias sat back on his heels and closed his eyes, letting the moment settle. He did not rush to uncover more. The city had taken centuries to disappear. It deserved patience in its return. Above him, the sky stretched wide and unchanging. Below him, something ancient waited, neither lost nor gone, only quiet. The air grew still, as if the desert itself had paused to watch. Elias remained seated beside the revealed stone, his palm resting lightly on its surface. It was cool despite the sun, holding the night within it, and that quiet temperature told him much. Stone remembered. It kept the stories of shade and shelter long after roofs had fallen and walls had sunk away. He brushed a little more sand aside, slowly, carefully, letting each grain fall where it wished. A line appeared, then another, edges meeting at an angle too deliberate to be natural. This was not a solitary stone. It was part of something larger, something planned. A wall, perhaps, or the foundation of a home where someone once slept, dreamed, and waited for morning. Elias leaned back and allowed his eyes to soften. He had learned that sometimes seeing too sharply could make one miss the whole. In the gentle blur, the land began to suggest its old shape. The dunes became streets. The wind traced paths where people once walked. Even the silence felt inhabited, filled with echoes too faint to hear but strong enough to sense. He imagined the city waking at dawn, doors opening, fires rekindled, water drawn carefully from wells. There would have been hardship here too, droughts, long journeys, seasons of fear when the wind brought no rain. But there would have been hope as well. Communities always carried hope, or they did not survive at all. The thought steadied him. This was not a place of tragedy alone. It was a place of endurance. A small shadow passed over the stone as a cloud drifted across the sun. For a moment the light dimmed and the desert cooled. Elias felt a deep, quiet gratitude for being here, for being allowed this first glimpse. Not every search led to such moments. Many ended in silence and disappointment. But today, the past had chosen to respond. He marked the location in his notebook with careful lines and soft pencil marks, adding notes that only he would fully understand. There would be time later for instruments, for colleagues, for official steps. For now, this was enough. The city had begun to remember itself, and Elias had been there to witness the first breath of that memory. As the sun lowered slightly, the stone seemed to settle back into the sand, content, unhurried. Elias rose and stepped away, leaving it partly covered, protected by the same desert that had hidden it for so long. Some things, he knew, were revealed best in stages. Evening arrived gently, as it always did in the desert, without sound or ceremony. The heat loosened its grip, and the sky deepened from pale blue to amber, then to a soft, endless indigo. Elias returned to his camp as the first stars appeared, each one steady and unhurried, as if they too had been waiting a long time. He lit a small lantern, its glow warm and contained, and prepared a simple meal. The quiet clink of metal and the slow rhythm of his movements felt soothing, familiar. Beyond the circle of light, the desert stretched into darkness, holding the day's discoveries close to its surface, like a secret not yet ready to be spoken aloud. As he ate, Elias gazed toward the dunes where the stone lay hidden again. In the fading light, he imagined the city at night as it once was. Lamps flickering along narrow streets, voices lowered as families gathered indoors. The sky above them filled with the same stars now watching him. Time folded gently in his thoughts, not collapsing, not overwhelming, just aligning. There was a loneliness in this work, he knew. Nights like this could feel very long, especially when doubts crept in. What if the city was smaller than he hoped? What if the evidence faded as he uncovered it? What if the world did not care? These thoughts drifted through his mind like passing clouds, acknowledged but not held. Because there was comfort here, too, comfort in knowing he was not the first to sit beneath this sky and wonder. Comfort in the steady presence of the land, which asked for patience, not certainty. The desert did not reward haste, but it welcomed those who moved gently. Later, as the lantern dimmed, Elias lay on his mat and listened to the night. The wind moved softly, carrying grains of sand that whispered against the tent. Somewhere far away, something shifted, a small animal perhaps, or simply the cooling earth settling into itself. Before sleep claimed him, Elias felt a quiet sense of reassurance. The city was there. It was real. And it was not in danger of being lost again, not as long as someone remembered to listen. Above him the stars held their positions, calm and enduring, as they had for all the nights the city below had known. Sleep came slowly, like a tide easing its way across the shore. Elias lay still as his breathing softened, the desert night wrapping around him in layers of cool air and distant silence. The lantern's glow faded completely, leaving only starlight filtering through the thin fabric of the tent. In that quiet, his thoughts loosened their hold and dreams began to form. He found himself walking streets that no longer existed, though they felt solid beneath his feet. The sand was gone, replaced by worn stone, smoothed by countless footsteps. Buildings rose on either side, simple, strong, touched by age but not decay. Doorways stood open, welcoming rather than abandoned, and warm light spilled onto the path ahead of him. People passed by without surprise, their faces calm, their movements unhurried. They did not speak, yet their presence carried a gentle acknowledgment, as if they recognized him not as an intruder, but as a guest arriving late. Elias felt no fear in this dream, only a deep, steady peace. The city was alive, and it knew him. At the center of the streets, he reached a wide-open space, a gathering place where the ground bore the marks of many seasons. Here the air felt different, heavier with memory. He knelt and pressed his hand to the stone, just as he had done in waking life, and felt a quiet pulse beneath his palm. Not a sound, not a voice, just a shared understanding. The dream shifted softly. Wind returned, lifting grains of sand that drifted down like snow, covering the streets inch by inch. Yet there was no panic, no struggle. The people moved calmly, securing doors, guiding one another, trusting that what was built would endure, even unseen. The city was not dying. It was resting. Elias stirred as the first light of dawn brushed the horizon. The dream faded, but its calm remained, settling into him like a promise. He opened his eyes to the pale desert morning, feeling refreshed, grounded, and quietly certain that he was exactly where he needed to be. Some dreams were not messages to decipher, he believed. Some were simply reminders that the past was not gone and that listening, truly listening, was a form of care. Dawn unfolded slowly, painting the desert in soft layers of peach and gold. Elias stepped from his tent and inhaled the cool morning air, letting it fill his lungs and steady his thoughts. The night's dream lingered like a warm echo, not demanding attention, only offering quiet reassurance. He brewed tea once more, watching steam rise and dissolve into the brightening sky. Around him, the land seemed unchanged, yet he sensed a subtle difference, as if the desert had shifted its weight, acknowledging the day ahead. Morning was the best time for careful observation. Shadows were long, and the low sun revealed shapes the midday light would hide. Elias walked back toward the place where the stone lay buried. His pace was unhurried, each step chosen with care. He carried no urgency, no expectation of immediate answers. The work ahead would take time, weeks, perhaps months, but time was something he was willing to give. As sunlight reached the dunes, faint lines appeared once more, suggestions of angles and boundaries just beneath the surface. Elias knelt again, brushing sand aside in small, deliberate movements. More stone revealed itself, forming a subtle curve that hinted at a larger structure. He paused often, allowing the moment to breathe, honoring the balance between curiosity and respect. There would be struggle ahead, he knew, permissions to secure, teams to assemble, long days under the sun, and longer nights reviewing fragments of history that refused easy interpretation. Yet hope moved quietly alongside these thoughts. This city had survived drought, abandonment, and centuries of burial. It could survive careful rediscovery as well. Elias marked new notes in his journal, his handwriting slow and steady. He smiled, not in triumph, but in gratitude. Each small revelation felt like a conversation, a mutual agreement between past and present. As the sun climbed higher, he covered the stones once more, protecting them from the heat and wind. The city had waited long enough. It would not be rushed now. The desert returned to its calm, and Elias stood, feeling grounded, patient, and ready. By midday, the sun rested high and steady, and the desert grew quiet in a deeper way. Even the wind seemed to pause, leaving the dunes smooth and undisturbed. Elias retreated to the shade of a rock outcrop, letting the stillness settle around him like a heavy but gentle blanket. Silence in the desert was never empty. It carried weight, presence, and memory. Elias had learned to respect it, to sit within it without trying to fill it. As he rested, he listened, not for sounds, but for patterns. The way heat shimmered near the ground, the way distant dunes seemed to blur into one another. These details told their own quiet stories. He thought of the city again, not as ruins or artifacts, but as a living place shaped by choices and resilience. People had built here knowing the land could be harsh. They had learned when to store water, when to travel, when to wait. Their lives had not been easy, but they had been purposeful. That purpose lingered still woven into the soil. Elias felt a familiar tension rise within him, the pull between solitude and responsibility. Part of him wished to remain here alone, guarding the city's sleep, keeping it safe from careless attention. Another part understood that knowledge, when shared thoughtfully, could protect as much as it exposed. It was a delicate balance, one he had navigated before, and would again. A slow breath eased the tension. There was no need to decide everything today. As afternoon light softened, Elias rose and walked the perimeter of the site, careful not to disturb the sand more than necessary. From this angle, he could see how the land itself curved protectively around the hidden structures, as if the desert had chosen to shelter them. The thought brought him quiet comfort. He paused once more, placing a small stone marker where only he would recognize its meaning, a promise to return prepared, with care and humility. The silence accepted the gesture without response, and the desert remained calm, vast, and patient. Late afternoon brought movement back to the air. A gentle breeze returned, flowing across the dunes in long, unbroken lines. Elias walked slowly along a ridge, allowing the wind to brush against his face and carry away the warmth of the day. With each step, the sand shifted softly, whispering sounds that felt almost like breath. The wind had a way of revealing what the eye could not. As it skimmed the surface, faint outlines emerged, subtle depressions that aligned too precisely to be natural. Elias followed them, not directly, but at an angle, letting perspective do its quiet work. From here, the land suggested order, parallel lines, a widening space, the ghost of a road. He stopped and closed his eyes, letting the wind pass through him. In its steady rhythm, he imagined the sounds that once filled this place. Footsteps on stone, the low murmur of conversation, the creak of wooden doors. These echoes were not loud or intrusive. They blended seamlessly with the present, enriching the silence rather than breaking it. There was comfort in this layering of time. Elias did not feel the past pressing down on him, but resting alongside him like an old companion. The struggles that had once shaped this city, scarcity, change, uncertainty, felt familiar in a quiet way. Humanity had always faced such moments and always found ways to endure. He made careful sketches in his notebook, capturing the shapes suggested by light and wind. These drawings were not precise maps, but impressions, starting points for future understanding. He trusted them because they came from patience rather than haste. As the sun dipped lower, the dunes glowed softly and the shadows lengthened into calm, sweeping forms. Elias felt a gentle sense of alignment, as if the land and his purpose were moving together, unforced and steady. The wind slowed as evening approached, leaving the desert peaceful once more. The echoes faded, but their presence remained, quietly affirming what lay beneath. As twilight deepened, Elias sat on a low dune overlooking the hidden city. The sky shifted through layers of lavender and deep blue, and the first evening star appeared, steady and calm. He opened his notebook again, flipping through pages filled with lines, symbols, and careful observations. There was a space he had left intentionally blank at the front, a place for a name. Most discoveries demanded names quickly, labels to satisfy reports, headlines, and expectations. But Elias hesitated. Names carried weight. They shaped how a place would be remembered, how it would be treated. This city had existed long before words were written about it, and it deserved more than a hurried title. He closed his eyes and listened. The desert offered no spoken answer, only the steady rhythm of cooling air and the soft settling of sand. Elias realized then that perhaps the city did not need a name yet, or perhaps its true name had been carried away long ago, spoken only in voices now silent. Instead, he wrote a single phrase, "The place that waited." It was not a claim of ownership nor a declaration of discovery. It was a reminder to himself, and one day to others, that this city had endured without recognition, and that patience had been its greatest ally. A faint smile crossed his face as he capped his pen. The struggle to name, to define, to control, eased into something gentler. Understanding could come slowly. Respect could come first. Night settled fully now, and the desert grew cool once more. Elias stood and stretched, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a day lived attentively. Tomorrow would bring more work, more questions, and perhaps more answers. But for now, the city rested beneath the sand, unnamed yet deeply known. Above, the stars brightened, ancient and watchful, bearing witness as they always had. Morning came with a pale, gentle light, and with it the understanding that Elias could not stay forever. Not yet. Supplies were limited, and careful planning would be needed before anything more could be done. The city had been found, but now it needed protection, not haste. He packed his camp slowly, folding canvas, extinguishing the last embers, leaving no unnecessary trace. The desert rewarded such care with silence and calm. Before departing, Elias walked once more to the place where stone lay hidden. He knelt, resting his hand lightly on the sand, a quiet gesture of respect. "I'll return," he whispered, not as a promise of possession, but as one of responsibility. The journey back was long and quiet. The dunes seemed endless, their shapes shifting subtly with each passing hour. Yet Elias felt lighter than he had in days. There was comfort in knowing where he was going, and why. The city's presence traveled with him, not as a burden, but as a steady companion. As he walked, he thought of the steps ahead, careful proposals, trusted colleagues, protective measures. There would be challenges, skepticism, bureaucracy, the risk that attention might bring harm instead of preservation. These struggles weighed on him, but they did not overwhelm. He had faced similar moments before, and patience had always been his guide. By late afternoon, the edge of the desert softened, giving way to scattered stone and distant signs of life. Elias paused once more and turned back, gazing toward the horizon where the hidden city lay. It was invisible now, indistinguishable from the land itself, and that, he thought, was its strength. He turned forward again, walking steadily toward the work that awaited him, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that something ancient had been found, and that its future depended on gentleness. The town at the desert's edge welcomed Elias with muted sounds, soft footsteps on stone, the distant murmur of voices, the low hum of evening life returning after the heat of day. It felt almost overwhelming after so much silence, yet he moved through it calmly, letting the contrast wash over him without resistance. In a small rented room, lit by a single lamp, Elias spread his notes across a simple wooden table. Maps, sketches, observations, all the fragile bridges between what he had felt in the desert and what he would soon need to explain to others. This part of the work was always the hardest. Paper demanded clarity, memory preferred subtlety. He worked slowly, choosing words that honored uncertainty instead of erasing it. He avoided bold claims, dramatic language, and sharp conclusions. Instead, he described patterns, possibilities, and care. The city, he knew, would reveal itself more fully in time. For now it needed space to breathe. As night deepened, fatigue settled into his bones, gentle but persistent. Elias leaned back and closed his eyes, allowing the images to return, the curve of stone beneath the sand, the quiet dream of streets once walked, the feeling of being recognized by a place older than any record. These memories felt more solid than ink. There was struggle here, too. Doubt whispered softly, asking if patience would be misunderstood as hesitation, if gentleness would be mistaken for weakness. Elias acknowledged the doubt, then let it pass. He had learned that certainty often arrived only after endurance. Before sleep, he folded his notes carefully and set them aside. Tomorrow the formal steps would begin, emails, meetings, careful conversations, but tonight belonged to memory and to rest. Outside, the desert lay unseen but unchanged, holding its city close, waiting calmly for the next careful touch. Days passed quietly, measured not by urgency, but by intention. Elias met with a small circle of colleagues he trusted, people known not for loud discoveries, but for careful hands and patient minds. They gathered in modest rooms, over shared meals and soft-spoken conversations, listening more than they spoke. Elias unfolded his maps slowly, letting the story emerge at its own pace. He described the land, the patterns in the sand, the feeling of presence that could not be captured fully in photographs. Some nodded in recognition, having felt similar things in other forgotten places. Others asked gentle questions, their curiosity grounded in respect rather than ambition. There was no rush to celebrate, no sudden declarations, just an understanding forming piece by piece like a mosaic assembled in silence. One colleague traced a line on the map with a thoughtful finger, noting how the shapes aligned with ancient trade routes long dismissed as speculative. Another spoke of comparable cities swallowed by shifting climates, their abandonment not sudden, but gradual and careful. The conversation felt less like planning and more like remembering together. Still, uncertainty lingered. Funding would be limited, permissions complex. Protection measures would need to be in place before even the smallest excavation could begin. Elias felt the familiar weight of these realities, but it no longer pressed heavily. Shared responsibility had a way of softening burdens. That evening, as they parted, one of them paused and said quietly, "You listened before you looked? That matters." The words stayed with Elias as he walked home beneath a sky dimmed by city lights. He realized then that the city in the desert was already changing lives, not by revealing its walls, but by reminding people how to approach what is fragile. The path ahead would be slow, but it would be shared. Preparation unfolded like a careful ritual. Lists were made and revised, not to speed the work, but to slow it down, to ensure that nothing essential was overlooked. Elias and his colleagues spoke often of limits, how far to dig, when to stop, what to leave untouched. These conversations felt as important as the discovery itself. Permits took time. Weeks passed in patient waiting, filled with reading, quiet planning, and long walks that helped Elias keep his thoughts steady. At times, the stillness felt like a test of faith, but each delay also felt like a layer of protection, shielding the city from impulsive hands. When approval finally came, it was modest. A small team, a narrow window of time, strict conditions. Elias welcomed every restriction. They were signs that care, not spectacle, would guide the work. Supplies were chosen with intention: soft brushes, light tools, coverings to shield exposed stone from sun and wind. No heavy machinery, no unnecessary disruption. The goal was understanding, not conquest. On the eve of their departure, Elias packed once more, this time not alone. The quiet weight of responsibility returned, balanced now by trust. He slept lightly, dreams filled not with streets and voices, but with the calm certainty of readiness. The city had waited long enough, and now, at last, the return would be made, not loudly, not quickly, but with hands prepared to listen again. The convoy moved slowly into the desert at dawn, leaving only faint tracks that the wind would soon soften. Elias rode quietly, watching the horizon brighten as familiar dunes rose to greet them. Though there were more people now, soft voices, shared supplies, careful glances, the land felt no less calm. If anything, it seemed to breathe more easily, as if reassured by the unhurried approach. When they reached the site, the team paused together. No one spoke at first. The silence was not awkward. It was respectful. Elias felt it settle over them like a shared understanding. This was not a place to rush into with words. He led them to the shaded area where the stone lay protected, still mostly hidden, still patient. Tools were unpacked with deliberation, brushes laid out like instruments for a quiet performance, water shared, hats adjusted. Each movement was slow, intentional, almost ceremonial. Elias demonstrated the first motions himself, showing how to let the sand fall away naturally, how to stop before curiosity became intrusion. As the first stones emerged again, there was no gasp, no sudden excitement. Only a deepening focus. The city did not reveal itself all at once. It offered edges, curves, hints of design, enough to confirm presence, not enough to overwhelm. There was struggle even in this gentleness. Holding back took effort. Stopping when there was more to see required discipline. But hope lived in those pauses, in the shared trust that what was left for tomorrow would still be there. By late afternoon, the stones rested once more beneath protective coverings. The team stepped back, satisfied not by how much they had uncovered, but by how carefully they had begun. As the sun lowered, Elias felt a quiet alignment return. Many footsteps now stood where once there had been one, but the heart guiding them remained steady, calm, and attentive. The next day settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings began early while the air was still cool and forgiving. The team worked in silence more often than speech, each person moving with a calm awareness of the space they occupied. Sand was lifted grain by grain, revealing lines that slowly began to speak of intention. Walls connected to other walls. Curves met straight edges. What had once seemed like isolated stones now formed a quiet network, a neighborhood perhaps, or a cluster of homes designed to shelter against wind and heat. Elias watched these patterns emerge with steady attention, resisting the urge to name them too quickly. There were moments of fatigue. The sun grew stronger as the day wore on, and muscles ached from restraint more than effort. Yet the mood remained peaceful. Each pause, each shared glance, carried the understanding that they were working with time itself, not against it. Elias spent long moments sketching, capturing relationships rather than details. He noted how doorways faced away from prevailing winds, how walls thickened on one side, how pathways curved to guide shade. These were choices made by people who knew this land intimately. Their wisdom lingered in the stone. At midday, work stopped. The site rested under coverings, protected from the harshest light. The team gathered in the shade, sharing water and quiet conversation. Laughter surfaced now and then, soft and brief, never breaking the calm. Hope grew in these small confirmations. The city was not a myth, not a scattered anomaly. It was intentional, thoughtful, resilient. And with each careful reveal, it seemed to reward patience with clarity. As evening returned, the sand was smoothed back into place. Nothing was left exposed overnight. The city, once more, was allowed to sleep. As the days continued, Elias began to notice something quieter than walls and pathways, something that did not announce itself with shape, but with feeling. The stones themselves seemed to carry a rhythm, a logic that went beyond construction. This city had been built with an understanding not only of survival, but of harmony. He knelt beside a partially revealed threshold, tracing its worn edge without touching it. The stone dipped slightly at the center, shaped by countless feet passing through. This was not decay, it was use. Life had moved here gently, repeatedly, until the material itself had learned the shape of human presence. Elias shared this observation with the team, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to notice. Soon others began pointing out similar details, a low wall positioned perfectly for sitting in evening shade, a narrow passage that slowed the wind, a shallow groove likely carved to guide rainwater toward storage. Together, these details formed a language, not written, not spoken, but built. The city spoke of cooperation, of patience, of adaptation, rather than domination. It did not fight the desert. It listened to it. There was struggle in recognizing this, too. Elias felt the weight of comparison, how much modern life often ignored such wisdom, how quickly balance could be lost. The thought passed through him quietly, without bitterness. This was not a lesson to preach, only one to remember. As the sun dipped low, the stones caught the light, briefly, glowing warm and soft, before fading back into shadow. Elias felt a calm gratitude settle in his chest. The city was teaching them slowly, in its own time, and they were listening. One afternoon, as the team prepared to cover the site, the wind changed. It did not arrive suddenly or violently, but with a subtle difference in tone, a deeper note in the desert's breath. Elias felt it first on his skin, a cooler current brushing past, carrying sand from a direction it had not before. They paused, watching as the surface of the dunes reshaped itself. Fine grains slid away from certain areas and gathered in others, revealing faint impressions the team had not yet seen. It was as if the desert itself had chosen to assist, unveiling just enough to suggest something more. Elias signaled for stillness. No tools were lifted. No one rushed forward. They observed as the wind worked patiently, uncovering the gentle arc of a wide space, larger than a home, more open than a street, a gathering place perhaps, or a center where voices once rose together. There was a quiet awe in that moment, not loud or dramatic, just a shared awareness that discovery did not always come from effort. Sometimes it came from waiting. The wind moved on as calmly as it had arrived, leaving the sand settled into a new balance. Elias exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. The city had revealed something on its own terms, reinforcing what he had always believed, that respect invited cooperation, even from the land. That evening, the team spoke little. Each person carried the moment privately, letting it find its own meaning. For Elias, it felt like reassurance. The city was not resisting their presence. It was guiding it. And so, with renewed care, they adjusted their plans, marking the new shape in their notes, grateful for the reminder that patience was not passive, it was active listening. The following morning arrived cool and pale, the kind of dawn that felt like a held breath. Elias walked first to the newly revealed space, his steps slow, respectful, as though approaching a sleeping animal. The sand lay thinner here, as if the land itself preferred not to hide this place completely. They worked carefully around the edges, never cutting into the heart of it. What emerged was not enclosed by walls, but shaped by intention, a broad open area where the ground had been deliberately leveled. Stones lay arranged at a distance, not as barriers, but as markers. This was a place meant to gather, not to contain. Elias felt a quiet warmth at the thought. A city center was often its loudest, busiest place, but this one seemed designed for calm. Perhaps people had come here to share water, to settle disputes, to celebrate small victories, or simply to sit together as evening fell. The openness spoke of trust. There was struggle in interpreting absence. Without walls or inscriptions, certainty remained just beyond reach. Yet hope filled that uncertainty. Not everything needed to be proven immediately. Some truths were felt more than measured. The team paused often, allowing the shape of the space to settle into their understanding. No one spoke loudly. Even movement felt softened here, as if sound itself was being absorbed by memory. As the sun rose higher, light spread evenly across the open ground, unbroken by shadow. Elias imagined it filled with people long ago, standing where he now stood, looking up at the same sky. The thought was grounding, humbling, and deeply peaceful. They covered the area gently before leaving for the day, protecting it as one might protect a resting friend. The city had shared its heart, not in grandeur, but in quiet openness. Time began to feel different at the site. Days no longer stood apart as separate units, but flowed into one another like slow-moving water. Elias noticed this one evening as he reviewed his notes. The dates mattered less than the sequence of patience, observation, and rest. The city seemed to operate on the same rhythm, unconcerned with urgency. They began to find subtle markers of time embedded in the design. A line of stones aligned with the horizon where the sun rose at a particular season. A narrow opening that caught the first light of morning only during certain months. These were not grand monuments, but gentle calibrations, ways of listening to the sky and responding with care. Elias felt a quiet admiration for the people who had lived here. They had not tried to control time. They had measured it, lived within it, and allowed it to pass without resistance. Their struggles, uncertain rains, shifting trade routes, the slow advance of sand, had been met not with force, but with adaptation. The team worked even more slowly now, adjusting their pace to match what the city seemed to ask of them. Breaks grew longer. Observation took precedence over action. There was comfort in this restraint, a sense that they were learning not just about a place, but from it. One afternoon, Elias sat alone at the edge of the open center, watching shadows lengthen. He felt no pressure to fill the silence. The city did not need constant attention. It existed fully, even when unseen. As dusk settled, he closed his notebook and rested his hands on his knees, breathing evenly. The measure of time here was not counted in hours or days, but in care given and received. As their work deepened, the city began to offer smaller things, not grand structures, but traces of everyday life. A fragment of pottery surfaced, its edge smoothed by use rather than breakage. A shallow stone bowl emerged nearby, worn thin at the center. These were not treasures in the usual sense. They were ordinary, and that ordinariness felt profound. Elias held the pottery fragment briefly, resting it on his open palm. It was cool, quiet, unassuming. Someone had once shaped it with care, not knowing it would survive centuries of sand and silence. The thought carried both struggle and hope, the fragility of human effort, and its unexpected endurance. The team documented each piece carefully, then returned it to rest, leaving nothing exposed. These objects were not meant to be removed yet. Their meaning was tied to place, to context, to the air and light that surrounded them. Elias believed deeply in this restraint. Removing too much too soon risked turning lives into artifacts instead of stories. There was a gentle sadness in these moments. Lives had been lived fully here, then slowly withdrawn. But there was peace too. Nothing felt abandoned in haste. The city had not been erased. It had been laid down, carefully, layer by layer, until the desert took over the task of keeping. As the afternoon softened, Elias noticed how the team handled these discoveries with growing reverence. Hands moved more slowly. Voices lowered without instruction. The city was shaping them, teaching them how to behave within its presence. When evening came, Elias sat quietly, watching the sand drift back into place. What was left behind was not loss. It was continuity, a reminder that even the smallest human acts could echo far beyond their time. One morning, Elias made a decision that surprised no one, yet felt deeply significant. He called for a pause. The tools were set down. Notes were closed. The coverings remained in place. The site rested, untouched for the day. At first, the stillness felt unfamiliar, almost heavy, as if something important were being withheld. But as the hours passed, that feeling softened into relief. Elias spent the day walking the perimeter alone, not measuring or recording, simply being present. The desert welcomed the quiet, its vastness stretching out without demand. He watched how light moved across the dunes, how shadows formed and dissolved, how the land breathed when left undisturbed. There was struggle in choosing not to act. In the world beyond the desert, progress was often measured by visible change. Yet here, Elias felt certain that restraint was its own form of progress. The city had given much already. It deserved space to remain whole. That evening, the team gathered without agenda. They shared simple food, quiet reflections, and long pauses between words. No one felt the need to justify the day. The pause itself had meaning. As night settled in, Elias looked toward the hidden city and felt a calm assurance. Listening sometimes meant doing nothing at all, and in that stillness, understanding often grew deeper than any excavation could reach. After the day of pause, something subtle had changed. It was not visible in the sand or stone, but in the way the team moved, quieter, more attuned, as if they had learned to hear something beneath their own thoughts. Work resumed gently, without announcement, each person returning to their place with renewed calm. Elias noticed that the city now felt less like a sight and more like a presence. When he knelt, he did so slowly, aware of his breathing, of the space his body occupied. The desert air felt cool against his skin, carrying no scent but openness itself. In that openness, stories seemed to rise, not as words, but as impressions. He imagined a morning long ago, much like this one. Someone stepping outside their home, feeling the same cool air before the heat arrived. Someone pausing, not from fear or urgency, but from gratitude for another beginning. These imagined moments did not distract Elias from his work. They deepened it, grounding each careful movement in empathy. A new section of stone emerged, low and circular, its surface smoothed by repeated contact. Perhaps a place to rest water vessels, perhaps a gathering point for shared tasks. The team did not rush to define it. They allowed the shape to exist without explanation, trusting that meaning would surface in time. There was comfort in this uncertainty. The city did not demand to be fully understood all at once. It offered fragments, and in those fragments, space for reflection. Elias felt hope in that, hope that understanding could be layered, gentle, and kind. As the sun rose higher, light pooled softly across the stones, and the air shimmered faintly. Elias sat back and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle. The stories were there, not spoken, not written, but present, steady, and patient. There are moments when time seems to thin, when the distance between now and then grows almost transparent. One such moment arrived quietly in the early afternoon, as Elias worked near the edge of the open center. The light shifted suddenly, softened by a passing veil of cloud. Shadows blurred, and for an instant the stones seemed to deepen in color, as if warmed by memory rather than sun. Elias paused, brush resting lightly in his hand, heart steady but attentive. He felt it then, not as a vision, not as sound, but as proximity, the sense that the past was not behind him, but beside him, that those who had lived here had not vanished, but had settled into the land itself, woven into its rhythms. The feeling was not overwhelming. It was gentle, reassuring. Elias breathed slowly, allowing it to pass through him without trying to hold it. He had learned long ago that such moments could not be summoned or prolonged. They arrived on their own and left the same way. The team felt it too, in their own ways. Movements slowed. Voices fell silent. No one spoke of it, yet the shared stillness said enough. For a while work ceased entirely, and the city rested under watchful, respectful eyes. When the light returned to normal and the air warmed again, the moment faded. But it left behind a quiet closeness, a reminder that time was not a wall, but a field, layered and wide. Elias resumed his work with renewed tenderness, aware that every stone touched not only the present, but something far deeper and older. As the days moved forward, a question began to surface. Not urgently, not insistently, but like a slow ripple spreading outward. Why had the city been left? There were no signs of sudden destruction, no layers of ash, no broken defenses. Everything suggested a gradual departure, measured and thoughtful. Elias found himself returning to this question often, turning it gently in his mind without forcing an answer. Perhaps the water had become unreliable. Perhaps trade routes had shifted, drawing people elsewhere. Or perhaps the desert itself had begun to move differently, inch by patient inch, making daily life harder with each passing year. None of these possibilities felt tragic. They felt practical, human. Elias imagined families discussing the decision over many evenings, weighing effort against hope, choosing when to stay and when to leave. There was struggle in such choices, but also courage. Leaving did not always mean failure. Sometimes it meant survival. This thought brought Elias a quiet sense of peace. The city was not a monument to loss. It was evidence of adaptation, of knowing when to carry life forward instead of holding it in place. The team found no single clue that answered the question fully, and that felt appropriate. Leaves were rarely shaped by one reason alone. They were shaped by many small pressures accumulated over time. As the sun dipped low, Elias wrote a single line in his notebook. They left with care. It felt enough. As understanding deepened, Elias became increasingly aware of what the city's people had chosen to take with them and what they had chosen to leave behind. The objects uncovered were useful, humble, and worn. Nothing suggested haste or panic. There were no abandoned tools mid-task, no signs of lives interrupted without warning. This told a quiet story. They had packed what mattered most: knowledge, skills, traditions carried in memory rather than stone. The city itself had been allowed to rest, trusted to the desert's care. What could not be carried, walls, paths, gathering spaces, had been given back to the land with dignity. Elias felt a gentle ache at this realization. Modern thinking often equated permanence with success. Yet here was proof that value could exist without endurance of form. What mattered most had moved on, alive and adaptable, while the city remained as a marker of where life had once paused. There was struggle in accepting this lesson. It challenged the instinct to preserve everything, to hold tightly to the physical past. But hope followed closely behind. If people could leave without erasing themselves, then history was not as fragile as it sometimes seemed. As the team worked, Elias noticed a shift in intention. They no longer searched for grand explanations. They observed quietly, documenting with humility. The city did not need to justify itself. Its existence was enough. At sunset, Elias stood alone at the edge of the site, watching the sand glow briefly before cooling into shadow. He felt grateful, not just for the discovery, but for the reminder that letting go could be an act of wisdom, not loss. The desert accepted everything in its time. And so, he realized, did history. By now, Elias no longer thought of the city as something to be uncovered. It had become something to learn from. Each day at the site felt less like work and more like quiet study, the kind that reshapes the way one moves through the world. He noticed how his own habits had changed. He walked more slowly, even away from the site. He spoke less, choosing words with greater care. The city's influence reached beyond its stones, teaching by example rather than instruction. The team felt it too. Decisions were made collaboratively, without tension. When uncertainty arose, no one rushed to resolve it. They allowed questions to remain open, trusting that clarity would come, or that it might not be necessary at all. Elias sat one afternoon near the open center, watching a thin line of shadow drift across the ground. He imagined the people who once sat here, learning in their own way, from elders, from seasons, from mistakes gently corrected over time. Knowledge here had likely been shared slowly, passed hand to hand like water. There was struggle in carrying this lesson back into the wider world. Elias knew that once reports were written and interest grew, pressures would follow. Expectations, timelines, demands for certainty. Yet hope steadied him. He had seen how patience could shape outcomes, how listening could protect what was fragile. The city had endured not because it resisted change, but because it adapted to it. That, Elias realized, was its greatest teaching. As evening settled in, he closed his notebook without writing. Some lessons were not meant to be recorded. They were meant to be lived. The season began to shift. The mornings grew cooler, the evenings longer, and the desert's light took on a softer, more amber tone. Elias recognized the signs with a calm acceptance. It was time to prepare for another departure. This leaving felt different from the first. The city was no longer unknown, but familiar, like a place one had visited many times in dreams. Elias and the team reviewed their notes, secured protective coverings, and ensured that nothing fragile was left exposed. Every action felt deliberate, unhurried. There was a quiet heaviness in these final days. Not sadness exactly, but awareness. The work here was not finished, only paused. And that pause, Elias knew, was essential. The city had shared enough for now. On the last evening, the team gathered near the open center without tools or notebooks. They sat in silence as the sun lowered, watching light drift across stone and sand one final time. No one spoke of future plans. The moment did not need framing. Elias felt gratitude rise gently within him for the people beside him, for the city beneath his feet, for the patience that had guided them all. Struggle and hope had braided together here, forming something steady and true. When night fell, the coverings were set carefully in place. The city returned to rest, wrapped once more in sand and shadow, protected by respect rather than secrecy. Leaving, Elias realized, was part of listening too. The morning of departure arrived quietly, without wind or urgency. The desert lay smooth and pale, as if it had already begun to erase the traces of human presence. Elias stood for a long moment at the edge of the site, taking in the familiar lines of dune and sky, knowing how little remained visible and how much rested safely beneath. The team moved carefully, dismantling camp with the same gentleness that had guided every step of their work. No voices were raised, no instructions hurried. Each person seemed aware that the desert was already reclaiming the space, folding it back into itself grain by grain. Elias walked one final slow circle around the perimeter. The coverings lay secure, stones hidden once more from sun and wind. To anyone passing by, this place would appear empty again. And that was exactly as it should be. There was a quiet struggle in this acceptance, the instinct to stay, to protect by presence alone. But hope balanced it, reminding Elias that the city had endured far longer without them than with them. Its strength was not dependent on constant attention. It rested in patience. As they departed, the convoy left faint tracks that softened almost immediately behind them. Elias watched the lines blur and disappear, feeling a calm satisfaction rather than loss. The city was not abandoned. It was entrusted. By the time the dunes rose between them and the site, the desert looked unchanged once more, vast, silent, and whole. And somewhere beneath that calm surface, a city rested, known now, respected, and gently remembered. Distance settled gently between Elias and the desert as days passed after their departure. Roads replaced dunes, and familiar sounds returned. Engines, voices, the measured rhythm of daily life. Yet something within him had shifted, quietly and permanently. Even when surrounded by people, Elias carried the desert's silence with him. It surfaced in small moments, the pause before speaking, the choice to listen longer, the comfort found in not needing immediate answers. The city had gone back beneath the sand, but it had not disappeared. It had moved inward. He reviewed notes occasionally, preparing reports written with care and restraint. Facts were recorded, patterns described. But much of what mattered most remained unwritten, held instead in memory, posture, and patience. Elias understood now that not every truth needed to be fully revealed to be protected. There was struggle in returning to a faster world, one that measured value by speed and visibility. Yet hope steadied him. He had seen another way of existing, one shaped by listening rather than taking, by knowing when to leave space untouched. Sometimes, late at night, Elias would close his eyes and imagine the desert again. The wind smoothing the dunes, the stars watching in their ancient calm. Beneath it all, the city resting, whole, quiet, and unafraid of being forgotten. Because it was not forgotten. It lived on in those who had learned from it and in the promise that patience could still uncover meaning without harm. The keeper of lost cities did not carry stones or relics away with him. He carried understanding, and that, he knew, was enough. Time passed gently, measured now in seasons rather than days. Elias settled back into his familiar routines, lectures given softly, papers reviewed carefully, long walks taken without destination. Life moved on, as it always did. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary moments, something stirred. It began subtly, a familiar pull while reading an unrelated report, a pause in conversation when someone mentioned shifting sands in a distant region. At night, dreams returned, not vivid, not demanding, but calm impressions of open skies and patient stone. The call had not ended, it had merely rested. Elias did not resist it. He had learned that such invitations could not be forced away, nor should they be chased. Instead, he listened, allowing the feeling to clarify itself over time. The city they had left was safe, protected by distance and care. But the desert was vast, and history was generous with its silences. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against his window, Elias unfolded an old map he had not studied in years. Its edges were worn, its markings uncertain. Yet as he traced a faded line with his finger, that same quiet recognition settled in his chest. The sense of a place waiting, not urgently, not impatiently, but with trust. There was struggle in beginning again. The weight of responsibility returned, along with the knowledge of how easily harm could be done. But hope stood beside it, steady and familiar. Elias was no longer walking alone. He carried lessons learned, boundaries respected, and a deeper understanding of when to step forward and when to pause. He rolled the map carefully and set it aside. There was no rush. The call had been heard, and that was enough for now. Somewhere, far beyond sight, another city rested beneath sand and sky, waiting not to be found, but to be listened to. The days that followed were quiet by design. Elias did not immediately plan an expedition or contact colleagues. Instead, he allowed the feeling of the call to settle, to reveal its shape without pressure. He knew now that rushing toward a destination often blurred the message it carried. He spent mornings reading slowly, returning to old field journals written by explorers who had valued patience over conquest. Their words were calm, almost hesitant, filled with pauses and uncertainty. Elias found comfort in that. It reminded him that careful listening had always been part of the work, even if history sometimes celebrated louder voices. In the afternoons he walked through familiar places, parks, libraries, quiet streets, practicing the same attentiveness he had learned in the desert. He watched how light moved across stone buildings, how footsteps echoed briefly and faded, how spaces held memory even when their original purpose was forgotten. Cities above ground, he realized, were not so different from those buried below. There was a gentle struggle in waiting. Part of him wanted clarity, direction, confirmation. but experience had taught him that waiting was not emptiness, it was preparation. Like sand settling after wind, understanding often arrived only after movement ceased. At night, Elias wrote not plans, but questions. What does this place need? How can it be protected before it is known? Who should be invited, and who should not? These questions did not demand immediate answers. They formed a quiet framework, steady and patient. As weeks passed, the call softened into something clearer, not urgency, but readiness. Elias felt no excitement, only calm resolve. When the time came to move again, it would be with the same care that had guided him before. For now, listening was enough. One morning, as light filtered gently through the window, Elias returned to the old map once more. It lay open on his desk, its surface worn thin by time and careful hands. He had not rushed to study it. Instead, he let his gaze rest where it wished, allowing patterns to emerge naturally. The map was incomplete, edges faded into uncertainty, symbols half erased, notes written in a script that suggested caution rather than confidence. Yet there was balance in its imperfections. Empty spaces were left unfilled, as if the cartographer had known that some things could only be discovered by standing on the land itself. Elias traced a faint line that curved toward a blank region marked only by a small symbol, a circle, lightly drawn, almost hesitant. It reminded him of the first map that had led him to the buried city, the one that had spoken softly, rather than clearly. The feeling returned, familiar and steady. This was not coincidence. It was continuity. There was struggle in trusting intuition again. Each journey carried risk of misinterpretation, of unintended harm, of bringing attention where protection was needed first. Elias acknowledged these concerns, letting them stand beside hope rather than oppose it. Experience had taught him that caution and curiosity could coexist. He made no marks on the map, no lines, no notes. Some things were not meant to be altered yet. Instead, he rolled it gently and placed it beside his notebook, as if allowing the two to keep each other company. Outside, the day unfolded slowly. Elias felt no pressure to act immediately. The map had waited many years already. It could wait a little longer, until listening had done its work. Elias began to reach out, but carefully, selectively, and without urgency. He did not announce a discovery or propose an expedition. Instead, he invited conversation, a shared walk, a quiet meal, a question asked without expectation of an answer. Those he contacted were familiar voices, people who understood restraint, who had learned that absence could be as meaningful as presence. They spoke of weather patterns changing in distant deserts, of oral histories that mentioned places where the sand learned to sleep, of satellite images that showed nothing at all, and therefore invited closer listening. These exchanges unfolded slowly, like evenings that did not mind becoming night. No plans were made, no dates chosen. What formed instead was alignment, a shared sense of readiness without pressure. Each person carried their own piece of the quiet, and together those pieces fit. There was struggle in resisting momentum. Once curiosity gathers, it often wants to move quickly, to justify itself with action. Elias held that impulse gently, reminding himself and others that summoning attention too soon could fracture what was still whole. Hope lived in the tone of these conversations, in the pauses, in the way no one rushed to fill silence. It felt less like assembling a team and more like recognizing one that already existed. When Elias returned home after these meetings, he felt calm rather than energized. That felt right. True readiness, he had learned, did not arrive loudly. It arrived like dusk, gradual, certain, and kind. The map remained rolled on his desk. The desert remained far away, and yet something important had begun, not a journey but a shared listening. Before any travel was planned, before routes were chosen or supplies discussed, something subtle but essential took shape. It was not a schedule nor a destination, but a shared understanding, an agreement made without words that the journey had already begun. Elias felt it during quiet moments at home, while washing a cup slowly, listening to water meet porcelain, while standing at a window as evening settled, watching light withdraw from familiar buildings. These small pauses carried the same quality he had known in the desert, attention without demand. Those who would eventually travel with him felt it too. Messages exchanged were brief and thoughtful. Questions were asked gently. No one pressed for certainty. The absence of urgency felt like a sign of trust in process, in restraint, in the idea that moving too soon could be a form of forgetting. There was struggle here, subtle, but real. The world beyond their circle moved quickly, measuring worth by visibility and speed. Elias felt that pressure occasionally like a distant vibration, yet it never fully reached him. He had learned how to remain still while movement passed around him. Hope lived in that stillness. Because when a journey began this way, rooted in listening, it carried a different weight. It did not seek to arrive, it sought to understand. One evening, Elias opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence, then closed it again. We are already on the path. The words felt complete. Nothing more was needed. The answer did not come as a sign, nor as a sudden certainty. It arrived the way most important things did now, quietly, without interruption. One evening, as Elias sat with the map unrolled beside him, the light from the setting sun touched a particular corner of the page, revealing a detail he had not noticed before. It was not new ink. It was absence. A place where the paper was thinner, worn almost translucent by time, as if many fingers had paused there before. The mark was subtle, easy to overlook, yet unmistakable once seen. Elias rested his hand nearby, not touching, simply acknowledging it. His breath slowed. The familiar calm settled in his chest. This was not confirmation. It was permission. He did not call anyone that night. He did not write notes or make plans. Instead, he folded the map carefully and placed it away, allowing the moment to remain whole and undisturbed. Some answers, he had learned, asked first to be respected, not acted upon. Outside, the night deepened. The city around him grew quiet, sounds thinning until only the most essential remained. Elias felt no excitement, no tension, only alignment. The desert had answered, not with direction, but with readiness. There would be time soon for movement, for preparation, for careful return to the land. But for now, this was enough. The call had been met with listening, and listening had been met with trust. Somewhere far away, beneath a sky just as calm, sand rested gently over stone once more, and the keeper of lost cities remained exactly where he needed to be, awake, patient, and at peace. The decision, when it finally formed, felt less like a choice and more like a natural turning, similar to the way night gives way to morning without effort or sound. Elias woke before dawn one day with a steady clarity resting inside him, calm and unquestioned. Outside, the sky was still dark, holding the last stars gently in place. He brewed tea and stood by the window, watching the horizon slowly soften. There was no rush in his movements. Each action flowed easily, guided by the same patience the desert had taught him. He opened his notebook and, for the first time in weeks, began to write plans, not dates or routes, but intentions. Words like care, distance, protection, and return appeared on the page. These were not instructions. They were reminders of how to move through the world without harming what waited quietly within it. As dawn arrived, light spreading like a promise across rooftops and stone, Elias felt a gentle hope settle deeper in his chest. The next journey would come, yes, but it would come softly, carried on trust rather than urgency. What mattered most was not reaching the buried city, but arriving with the right attention. The desert did not need saving. The cities beneath it did not need rescuing. They needed witnesses willing to move slowly, to pause, to leave again without regret. Elias closed the notebook and smiled faintly. The day had begun, and with it, a future shaped by listening. In the days that followed, Elias became aware of something comforting. He was not alone in his way of seeing. Without announcement or agreement, others had begun to act as quiet guardians too. Colleagues delayed publications. Institutions agreed to general language instead of precise coordinates. Curiosity was guided gently away from exact places and toward broader understanding. It felt like a circle forming, loose but intentional. Elias noticed how this protection did not feel restrictive. It felt generous. By withholding certain details, they were allowing the land to remain whole, unpressured by sudden attention. The city beneath the sand was not hidden out of fear, but sheltered out of respect. There was struggle in explaining this to those who asked directly. Some wanted clarity, access, certainty. Elias responded calmly, speaking of process rather than place, of values rather than locations. Not everyone understood, but enough did, and that was sufficient. Hope lived in these small acts of restraint, in the realization that preservation was not always about fences or guards, but about shared understanding, about choosing not to look too closely, too quickly. One evening, Elias walked beneath a sky washed clean by rain. The air smelled fresh, almost like the desert after a rare storm. He paused, breathing deeply, feeling the same quiet steadiness he had known among the dunes. Somewhere far away, the city rested under its blanket of sand, protected not just by distance, but by people who had learned when to step back. The quiet guardians were doing their work, and so was he. As time continued its slow, gentle movement, Elias came to a peaceful understanding. The cities he sought were never lost in the way people often imagined. They had not vanished by accident, nor were they waiting desperately to be uncovered. They had simply stepped aside, allowing the world to move on while they rested. This thought settled in him one evening as he sat quietly, watching dusk soften the edges of everything around him. Buildings, trees, distant hills, all of them seemed to blur into a shared stillness. He realized then that discovery was not the city's goal. Survival had been, continuity, balance. The buried city had never asked to be found. It had asked to be respected. There was struggle in letting go of the heroic idea of the discoverer, the one who brings light to darkness. But hope followed gently behind that letting go. A truer role emerged, one of witness, of caretaker, of someone who ensures that silence is not mistaken for emptiness. Elias felt a deep calm in this realization. He no longer measured his work by what was revealed, but by what remained unharmed. The city's greatest gift had not been its structures or stories, but the way it had reshaped his understanding of presence. As night arrived, he closed his eyes briefly, imagining sand settling softly over stone, stars keeping their patient watch. Nothing was missing. Nothing was incomplete. The city was whole, just as it was. The final season arrived without ceremony. No announcement marked it, no milestone or celebration. It came quietly, the way understanding often does, when nothing more needs to be added. Elias walked one evening along a familiar path near his home, the air cool and calm. Street lights glowed softly, and the world felt hushed, as if it too were preparing for rest. He moved slowly, feeling the ground beneath his feet, aware of how every place carried layers of past and present together. He thought of the cities beneath the sand, not as hidden wonders, but as settled companions. They did not call out any more. They did not need to. The work of listening had been done, and the listening itself had become part of who he was. There had been struggle along the way, moments of doubt, of restraint, of choosing silence over acclaim. Yet hope had always returned, steady and calm, guiding him toward balance rather than recognition. That night Elias slept deeply. No dreams of maps or stones came to him, only a gentle darkness, restful and complete. Somewhere, far beyond sight, sand lay undisturbed, and stars traced their ancient paths. The keeper of lost cities rested too, not because the work was finished, but because it had found its proper rhythm. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me. If this story brought you calm, reflection, or rest, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, whether it's late night in the U.S., early morning in Europe, or a peaceful hour somewhere else in the world. Now let your breathing slow, allow your thoughts to drift, and carry this stillness with you into rest.